Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us, wherever you are, for a very special conversation tonight. I'm Fran Barry, publisher at Wellcome Collection, and I'm going to give a very brief introduction before handing over to our wonderful speakers. Firstly, a little bit about who we are. Wellcome Collection is a free museum and library in London that explores health and being human, making connections across science, medicine, life and art. Yesterday, we opened our doors for the visitors for the first time since March. So if you can, we'd love to see you for a visit, or if not, you can check out our stories, books and live events online at welcomecollection.org. And for tonight's event, live speech-to-text is being provided by Stage Text. We'll also describe any visual elements referred to during the conversation. For any blind or partially sighted audience members, I'm currently in my living room. I'm wearing glasses and a blue jumper and my hair up in a bun. We're very excited to welcome you to the first of these digital events. It's such a privilege to have Elif Shafak and Professor Christie Watson with us today. Two powerful storytellers, best-selling novelists, writers and activists who in their own ways place empathy, compassion and connection at the heart of their work. Their books and their words are a real balm at such an uncertain and anxious time for many of us. And this event also marks the publication of Elif's powerful manifesto, How to Stay Sane in an Age of Division, which we're so proud to publish at Wellcome Collection. And to tell us more, I'll hand you over to our host tonight, Christie Watson. Christie has also just published an inspiring new book on the vital work of nurses, The Courage to Care, A Call for Compassion, based on her own return to the nursing frontline this spring, and following on from her best-selling memoir, The Language of Kindness. Christie has been awarded the Honorary Doctor of Letters for contributions to nursing and the arts, and is patron of the Royal College of Nursing Foundation. She is also Professor of Medical and Health Humanities at the University of East Anglia. So over to you, Christie, and I hope you all enjoy the event.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us this evening on what will be, I'm sure, a very interesting conversation. I am delighted to be here and welcoming Elif Shafak. And this is going to be about an hour long. We are going to be discussing things related to the book and all sorts of things for about 25 minutes. And then there'll be 30 minutes for questions. So if you can post your questions on Slido, that would be absolutely amazing. You can give your name and also whereabouts in the country or the world, indeed, that you're from. That would be incredible. We will be recording this event and it will be on the Wellcome channel, the YouTube channel afterwards. So I am so excited to be talking about how to stay sane in an age of division. And I'm just going to read the back of the blurb. Ours is the age of contagious anxiety. We feel overwhelmed by events around us, by injustice, by suffering, by an endless feeling of crisis. So how can we nurture the parts of ourselves that hope, trust, and believe in something better? And how can we stay sane in this age of division? And the writer, Elif Shafak, is my hero. So I am super excited to speak with her and ask her lots and lots of questions. But just a brief introduction, because I could introduce her all evening. Elif is an award-winning Booker Prize-nominated writer, storyteller, essayist, academic, public speaker, and activist. She has published 17 books, 11 of which are novels. Her work has been translated into 50 languages. Elif is an advocate for women's rights, LGBT+ rights, and freedom of speech. In 2017, she was chosen by Politico as one of the 12 people who will give you a much-needed lift of the heart. And my goodness, do we need a lift of the heart? Welcome, Elif, this evening.
Thank you so much, Christie. It really means a lot. Thank you.
I have so many questions for you. Just before we start, I know that we are being as inclusive as possible, and I just wanted to describe my surroundings. I'm wearing a teal dress. It's quite out of fashion now, I think, but I like the dress anyway. And I've got in my background a river because I'm at a friend's house because my tech wasn't working. Such is the time.
Lovely, lovely. And I love the dress. I love the color.
Oh, thank you.
I'll just give a brief description as well. My pronouns are she, her. I am in my living room. At the back, there are bookshelves. I have, I think, long, brown and very messy hair, and I'm wearing a green top.
Oh, wonderful. So let's talk business. This book reminded me so much of Khalil Gibran's The Prophet. I can't even tell you. And I didn't know if that was a conscious decision. And I wanted to start with that because it felt for me such a profound philosophical matching to that book, but also stylistically. I wondered about your choice to make this a narrative nonfiction poetic manifesto, as opposed to, for example, using the form of fiction or long form essay. So I wondered about why you chose to write this way.
I really love that you started with Khalil Gibran. Actually, no one had made that connection. I hadn't made that connection either. But Khalil Gibran is someone whom I've read early on in my life. And then I read again and again at several moments in my journey. And there's a simplicity to the voice that is very universal, actually. And in that regard, it feels like timeless and placeless, like as if he's interested in the core rather than, finding the right word. I love that way of writing. It's pure, it's transparent. And so it would make me very happy if you find any similarity or any connection. But also, I think there's a reason why this book was written in this moment in time, because I started writing it at the very beginning of the pandemic, when I was going through lots of anxieties, unknown, because this tunnel of change that it's a tunnel, lots of things that are changing. So I think I had to stop and ask myself, what am I doing right now? Is this the right thing to do? Because I was working on my novel. To put it differently, when people are dying in hundreds and thousands, when there's so much injustice in the world, when so much is happening, actually, I think we writers also ask ourselves, is this the book that I should be writing right now? What difference does it make if I find the perfect synonym? If I move that comma into the next line, is it going to make any difference? And I find it healthy to go into that kind of existential questioning. I wrote this book in a way to understand my own feelings, but also to make sense of this moment in time, this urgency. And I realize many people are struggling with negative emotions, whether it's anxiety or fear or bewilderment, confusion. I wanted to recognize the existence of these negative emotions in our lives, but then hopefully to turn them into something more positive and constructive.
Yes, I really felt that. And I felt that the original story that you gave at the beginning of watching a transgender woman from your flat, and you felt very much like she was a fighter and you were an observer, and you felt some guilt around that. And I feel like with this book, you're a fighter now. And I wondered what you think about the responsibility during this time that writers have to become more political.
Well, I've always believed that if you happen to be a storyteller, if you happen to be a writer from a wounded country, such as Turkey or Brazil, the Philippines, Belarus, imagine the list is quite long, actually, and that list is unfortunately getting longer and longer. So if you happen to be a writer from such countries, I honestly do not think that you have the luxury of being apolitical, non-political. You can't say, I really don't want to talk about what's happening outside the window. I just want to talk about my own fiction, my own stories. That's not possible when so much is happening outside the window. Also, I am a feminist. I've learned many wonderful things from feminist movements of past generations. And one of the core principles of feminism is that politics is not only about political parties or the parliament or what Boris Johnson said today. Politics is actually bigger than that. Wherever there's power, there is politics. So again, if you describe politics in such a broader way, in the sense that writing about sexuality and gender and the personal can also be very political, again, you can't be non-political as a writer. But if I may add this, I think we have entered an age more and more after 2016. Many writers feel this kind of urgency, whether they're in the West or the East, But so much is changing, and we have to speak up. We need to speak out and speak up about core fundamental democratic issues. I'm not interested in party politics, definitely not interested in partisan politics, but to be political about core democratic principles and to be alert about the dangers of losing them, I think is important in this age.
I agree completely. And I remember reading, I think the way that you've split it into sections of disillusionment and then anxiety, anger, apathy is so interesting. But it made me think of a time that I was teaching a swimming class to toddlers, and they were all on the side of the pool, and one of them chased a ball down the side of the pool, and everyone's eyes turned to this ball, and we all ran after this toddler. At which time, a little girl fell in the water, and we didn't see because our eyes were on this immediate threat.
Yeah.
And I wondered, I was thinking about that a lot reading this book, and I wondered about your incredible descriptions of all the things that are happening to us at the moment in our world in terms of threats to democracy, to the economy, the pandemic, but also threats to our values and freedom of speech as well. And all those things that are it's almost so much that it does tend to breed apathy. And you talk about apathy as the most dangerous of all things because a lack of emotion is the worst emotion of all. And I wondered if you could talk about the danger of apathy and why we should be very worried about this state that we're in.
Indeed. And I also think if from time to time we find ourselves overwhelmed with anger or anxiety or confusion, I think that's understandable. If we do not, in fact, maybe we're not really following what's happening in the world, because when we do follow everywhere what's happening, then of course it does create some fear or some anxiety or some confusion in us, which is okay, which is understandable. It is an energy that we need to transform. In other words, I think it's okay not to be okay at a moment like this.
Yeah.
For me, the most dangerous emotion is a lack of all emotions. In other words, it's numbness. The moment we become indifferent or desensitized, disconnected, if I stop caring about what's happening to another human being, if I stop caring about someone else's story or pain or sorrow, that kind of threshold of indifference, if it becomes widespread, I think that's going to be much, much more dangerous for the world. And when we read the memoirs of survivors, people who have survived the darkest chapters in human history, including the Holocaust, interestingly, almost all of them are saying something very similar. They're asking, how is it possible that such atrocities can occur on such a wide scale, on such a large scale? Is it because human beings are evil by nature? And the survivors are saying, actually, no. Most human beings are a combination of good and bad, like you, like me. There are evil people, but their numbers are relatively very small. So how do we explain the fact that atrocities or horrific things can happen on such a big scale? And the answer the survivors are giving is maybe the opposite of kindness is not necessarily evil. Maybe the opposite of goodness is not necessarily badness or wickedness. Maybe the opposite of good is in fact numbness. So if enough number of people stop caring about their fellow human beings, then a very small number of bad people can cause massive atrocities. And I think we should always be alert about the dangers of indifference and numbness and apathy.
Yes, and you talk about the fact that everything starts with language.
Yeah.
And that's such a key point throughout the book, and the fact that people, terrible things don't just suddenly happen. They build and they start with language.
Yes.
And I was thinking as well about Sarah Bakewell's At the Existentialist Cafe, and she describes in her book, which is brilliant, the thinkers, the artists, the writers, the intellectuals sitting around in Paris in the 30s saying, this guy Hitler is never going to get in, drinking their cocktails. And, I do feel like we're in a very precarious and dangerous thing. I think you talk about a threshold or a tipping point, that we are in a situation where there is a case for conscious optimism. And I think I'm a catastrophist by nature, but I really reread your book again. in the hope that I can gain some of your wisdom and hope. And what I really gained, I suppose, is this feeling that you had, that you called it an in-betweendom. We're in the margins. We are in between. I think I've got a quote here. A perplexing interval between a prolonged end and an unknown beginning. And I thought that was very beautiful, because writers live in this space. We always have. We live between the concrete and the abstract, the metaphorical and the literal. And we're kind of safe in that space. But I suppose everyone now realizes that the concrete isn't really concrete at all. And the ground is moving beneath our feet. And in the short term, that's a very dangerous space, because it allows for demagogues with slogans and all the things. But in the long term, it allows for nuance and grey thinking and less black and white thinking and more tolerance and less discrimination and all those wonderful things. I wonder if perhaps you could talk a little bit about your feelings about the short-term dangers that we face, but also your long-term optimism that we all crave and we all need right now.
So as I was listening to you, I was thinking of my grandmother, because for her, in between them, those in-between spaces where in a more traditional way, she would call them as the space, the place of the jinn, because it's more elusive. You can't exactly define it. And as I was writing this book, I remember that. I also remembered what Gramsci, the Italian thinker, philosopher, political philosopher, was talking about, because he was talking about how there comes a moment when the old order is no more, but the new order is not born yet. So you're in between these two moments in time. And in that threshold, lots of things can happen. There's potential for change, there's potential for improvement, but there's at the same time confusion. It is elusive. Nothing feels solid anymore, the ground beneath our feet. To maybe put it slightly differently, I think particularly until 2016 again, many people across the Western world, they assume that in a way the world was divided into two types of territories, the solid lands and the liquid lands.
Yeah.
So countries like Turkey, where I come from, were regarded as liquid lands, in the sense that everything was shifting, nothing was settled yet. Of course, Turkey clearly hasn't achieved democracy yet. So the idea was that there's a duality, that the Western world was in general more safe and solid and established, and democracy, at least in its core values, had been achieved. But now it feels like there's no such thing as solid lands versus liquid lands. And in fact, we're all living in liquid times. And now we know better, in the sense that we do understand that no country can take their rights for granted. We can't say that, well, you don't need feminism in this part of the world because it's already achieved. You can't say that freedom of speech is already achieved here. We don't need to worry about that. In fact, history shows us that countries can go backwards, that history doesn't always necessarily move forward. So we all need to be, I think, worried to a certain extent. We all need to be more engaged, involved citizens. And we do need to understand that we can't take our liberties for granted. We have to fight for them. We need to care for them. Democracy is a very delicate ecosystem of checks and balances. It requires attention. It requires love. So we need to be more engaged in that sense, I believe. But overall, I think being too much pessimistic doesn't help us either, because it weighs us down, it pulls us down. So we need a healthy combination of, in my opinion, between conscious optimism and creative pessimism. And this is a moment when we're going to need both of them.
Yeah, I love the questions that you ask in the book, because you're not necessarily offering answers, but you're giving meaning to the questions. Mm-hmm. What is democracy? Yeah. What is happiness? What are our values? All those things that are really, really important. And I think sometimes we look for the concrete, we look for the answers, and perhaps we need to look for the meaning. And that's what it felt like, such a philosophical meditation on where we're at right now. One of the things that I was very interested with, I suppose, is the idea that I'm interested in faith and spirituality and secularism, and whether a parent that I looked after, sorry, I'm backtracking, but a parent that looked after her daughter when she was very, very sick, and she was very religious, and I'm not particularly religious, but I was very interested in her absolute trust and conviction and belief. And she said to me, faith is not knowing, it's hoping. And I wonder whether we can hope or have faith when we don't trust our political systems. And maybe the rise in secularism has led to, I suppose, a shift in our value system, and what your thoughts about faith are.
It's such a beautiful question, a difficult question too. Difficult in a sense that I think we need a more nuanced territory to be able to talk about faith. I personally, I'm not a religious person. I'm not a believer. I have too much doubt in my mind and in my soul to become a believer. And I find doubt precious. I think belief without doubt is actually a dogma, and dogmas are dangerous. What I do not like is clashing certainties. I'm not very comfortable around people who are very certain of their own truths. So when I look at people who are very comfortable with their own religiosity, they usually want to get rid of doubt. And people who are very comfortable with their, for instance, atheism, they want to get rid of faith. Whereas I'm interested in between. Is there another way of talking about faith that is not religious? Is that possible? And I think it's a challenge for liberals, left, progressives, people who believe in secularism. As a woman, I find secularism so important. So is there another territory where we can talk about faith in maybe non-religious ways? I am interested in the dance of faith and doubt. I like it when they challenge each other. I wouldn't want them to stop talking to each other, because this is how we make progress. I think faith should challenge doubt, doubt should challenge faith constantly. So I personally, I think I've always felt closer to agnostics and agnosticism. And I find more humility in agnosticism, just to be able to say, I don't know. I'm still thinking, I'm still working on it. I'm on this journey. I like that. And I've always felt closer to mystics who were on the edge, on the periphery, mystics who were a little bit like misfits. Their voices have also been very much suppressed throughout history, like heterodox mysticism. And there's an area there that I find very interesting. But overall, I think my trouble with religion, or organized religion, is the distinction that it makes between us versus them, and this assumption that us is somehow closer to God, closer to heaven, or closer to truth than them. I don't like that. I don't find that close to my heart at all. What I'm interested in is personal spiritual journeys. And those journeys are unique. They're like our fingerprints. No one has the right to judge someone else's journey. Maybe you start your own journey as a Buddhist and you end it as a Jewish mystic, or vice versa. Who am I to know your journey, right? So there's something very personal, individual, inner-oriented in those spiritual journeys that I am interested in. And most importantly, I think we should be able to say, I'm still working on it. The journey is endless, rather than trying to find an answer and clashing certainties. I believe we should stay away from that.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because although the world feels absolutely ripe for the wrong type of person, it feels ripe for the right type of person as well. And maybe a rise, as well as all these terrible things that are happening, in something that's new related to spiritualism or faith. But I've gone on a tangent. But yeah, I wanted to ask as well about story. Now, with my medical humanities head on, I'm obsessed with storytelling and narrative, and I believe that people's stories is just as important to healing as their medication and technology, and an understanding of narrative and people's stories. We're made up of blood and bones and flesh, and we're made up of stories. And it's so important. And I think it can save lives to understand somebody's story. But I wanted to ask you if you can talk a little bit about what you think the power of stories is, and how important it is that stories connect us. And that's probably the central theme of the book, really, I'm guessing, but I'll let you talk about it.
Yeah, and like you, Christie, I do believe that we are made of stories, also our memories. If we look back and try to remember what we remember from our own journeys, it's usually through stories that we remember, and it's usually through emotions. I'm someone who finds emotional intelligence important, and I find empathy very important. There's no doubt we're living in a very troubled world. And earlier you were mentioning how it is a dangerous time for demagogues, because when everything feels so complex and tiring and exhausting, this is a dangerous moment, because the populist demagogue enters the stage and says, just leave it to me, I'm going to make everything simple for you. And many people feel like maybe things should be in that sense simple, and it's tiring, and maybe they should follow the demagogue. So there are lots of challenges that we need to deal with. But I honestly think literature helps. Literature shifts us, changes us. It gives us, empathy is a muscle, it teaches us how to empathize, how to put ourselves in the shoes of another person, if only for a few hours or for a few days. And that is good for us. It's a good cognitive flexibility, but it's also good for our soul. Yeah. There's no wonder, it's not a coincidence that people who have very rigid mindsets have very low capacity for empathy, because they haven't worked on it. They haven't put effort into it. Stories help us to see reality from different perspectives. But I also believe they rehumanize people who have been dehumanized. So at the heart of literature, there's resistance. We shouldn't forget that. Literature tries to give more voice to people who have been left voiceless, people who have been pushed to the margins, the periphery. So it does, in that regard, make the invisible a bit more visible. And I find that more and more important in a world in which we have widening, deepening inequalities.
I think so. I've just probably got one more question before we open up to everyone else's questions. I'm sure there are lots. And I wanted to ask about empathy. There's been so much research and a gazillion books written about empathy and what it actually is and what it means. And I think the stepping into other people's shoes is right. At its core, that's what it is. And my novelist heart says that it's possible to do that. And my nurse heart says that it's impossible to do that. And I'm very conflicted about the notion of whether it's truly possible to be empathetic, and because we really can't understand somebody else's struggles. Although as a novelist, I really try and do that. And I've been very interested in the word compassion, because compassion means to suffer with, alongside, to sit with them, to hold their hands. But empathy really means to step into someone else's experience. And I'm not sure what I think. So I wondered what you think about whether it's really possible to step in somebody's shoes and live their life even for a few hours.
I think it's possible, but I agree it's not easy. It is a challenge. And maybe it's a good thing to be aware of that challenge. But I also think it's, at the end of the day, maybe it comes down to identity, or how we see ourselves. Who am I? What kind of a person am I? How do I define myself, describe myself? These are essential questions. And sometimes we live our lives without asking it again and again, because we have one definition that helps us throughout our years. But I think it's important to think of ourselves not as singular identities, but in terms of multiple belongings. If I can recognize my own multiplicity, it will be easier for me to empathize with someone else, and to understand and to find what we have in common, what overlaps, if also that person describes themselves in terms of multiple belongings. I'm a big believer in multiple belongings and the need to defend multiplicity. When I look at myself, of course, I see myself as a Turkish writer, and I have strong local roots in that regard, cultural roots. But I'm also very attached to the Balkans. I have elements in my soul from the Middle East. By birth, the values that I share, I'm a European. Over the years, I have become a Londoner, a British citizen. And despite what politicians have been telling us lately, I would like to think of myself as a citizen of the world, citizen of humanity. That doesn't mean you're floating aimlessly in the air It doesn't mean you're a citizen of nowhere and you don't care about anything. Just the opposite. It means you have multiple attachments and you care about many things at the same time. But I guess my point is, even if we've stayed in the same town our whole lives, we still have multiple belongings. Whether it's stories of our ancestors, it could be our sexual identity, it could be our, cultural, political allegiances. Many, many stories compose the mystery that is a human being. So when I approach every human being as a complex, liquid creature, it becomes easier to melt into someone else's story. But that said, of course, before writing about someone else's story, we have to feel it in our hearts. It is a labor of love. You have to, really have to give a lot of attention, a lot of work into it. We can't just easily write about someone else's story. And the reader will always know the result, will always be the right judge. But I think it is possible for you to write about a Turkish person, or a male writer to write about the female experience. It doesn't have to be our own identity for us to feel someone else's story or pain or joy in our bones.
Well, that makes my novelist heart sing. So thank you. I'm going to glance at my phone screen now. I am not on social media, I can assure you. But I'm getting some questions from around the world. So if you will bear with me. The first question that we've had, Elif, is how do you turn your anxiety and anger into a constructive force?
Thank you so much. It's a question that I also ask myself very often, because I'm an anxious person, and anger, I think at a moment like this is very understandable, because when so much is happening, when I was writing this book, there were massive protests on major cities, on the streets of major cities, to protest against racial injustice, racial discrimination. And how can I not respect and recognize that kind of anger, which is very justified? But all I'm saying is, we also need to be careful about long-term anger, because in the long term, anger might become repetitive and it can become destructive as well. It can also lead in a strange way to apathy, because it can give us the illusion that nothing is changing anyhow in this world. So nothing positive is happening anyhow. So I respect and acknowledge the existence of anger in our lives when there are so many inequalities. But the next level, the next question is, how do we turn it into something positive? And for that, I think we need to connect with our fellow human beings. When we look at politics, politicians, systems, theoretical debates, it makes us angry. But when we listen to people of all backgrounds, and see their stories of resilience, see their stories of hope, see how people whose lives are much harder than our lives, and yet they are struggling, they're fighting, they're trying, I think that gives us a new sense of perspective. So how do I find hope? How do I find the optimism that my anxious mind needs? When I listen to people, I think we have to become really, really good listeners in this age, but also talk with people from very different backgrounds.
I think you talk in the book about we want to be heard, but paradoxically, if we want to be heard, then we must be prepared to listen. Sure. And that was a really beautiful sentiment, I think, and that's been lost recently, but so important. Thank you so much for that question, and please do ask any questions that you'd like on Slido, and you can say that who you are and where you're from in the world. That would be amazing. We've got quite a few coming through. Could Elif speak about the dangers of speaking up as a woman in Turkey, and could you ever return there? And that's a tough question, right?
That's a tough question. It's also an emotional question for me, to be honest, because of course I feel emotionally very attached to Turkey. And as you know, Turkey is not an easy place for writers, for journalists in particular. I have so much respect for journalists who are trying to do their jobs properly, for investigative journalism, which is, I think, threatened all around the world today. Turkey is also a very difficult place for academics. Anyone who deals with words, who wants to tell stories, because storytelling needs freedom of imagination, freedom of speech. Also, interestingly, it's a difficult place for instance, cartoonists, and that's not a coincidence, because I think Countries that have lost their democracy also lose their sense of humor. Humor becomes a dangerous thing. Humor is so healthy. We need compassionate, good humor in the public space. So life is not easy for many, many, many people in Turkey. And as you know, Turkey has become the world's leading jailer of journalists, surpassing even Russia's record or China's record. At the same time, it's a very patriarchal country. And I think it's a very homophobic country. And there are lots of issues that are very difficult to talk about. And if you are a woman writer, I think you have to struggle twice as hard, because you also have to deal with that sexism and patriarchy, which is deeply, deeply rooted. In a nutshell, I can tell you, many people are aware that it's not easy to write or talk about politics in countries that do not have freedom of speech. But sometimes people do not realize that it can be equally challenging to talk about gender and sexuality. And that too can become a challenge for women writers. Anything you say can offend people or offend authorities. But we need to carve out a space of freedom for art, for the art of storytelling, to be able to breathe.
Absolutely. A great question here is about the sort of practical side. What stories will you tell your friends and family about this pandemic in 10 years' time? And I wondered, a beautiful question, but I also wondered about what makes you hopeful at the moment, maybe.
What makes me hopeful is listening to young people, listening to minorities, listening to women, young men, reading their individual stories, listening to their personal stories, listening to refugees, what they have gone through. But I think particularly what excites me and what gives me hope is human connections that are still happening despite all the tribalism and isolationism and populist nationalism that we're being pushed into. Nonetheless, here we are. This is a diverse digital audience. We do connect, we do exchange ideas, words. We are thinking about issues that we all care about. So these human connections, I think, are what gives me hope. The way they transcend all kinds of national, religious, ethnic boundaries and the boundaries in our heads. And we're seeing actually more and more of this. In that sense, storytelling is universal and our need for it is timeless.
I agree. And I think that in the book, you so beautifully express the idea that we can only learn by speaking to people who are different from us, who have different opinions from us. If we are in our echo chambers the whole time on social media or being fed a narrative from an algorithm, then of course we will only carry on thinking the way that we've always thought. And so that challenge is a really positive thing that hopefully will come out in 10 years and look back and say, there were so many different opinions and I started to listen as well as give my own opinion. Gosia asks, who should one look up to in troubled times? What a great question.
What a great question. Yeah. I think I don't believe in heroes, and maybe I still like what Bertolt Brecht was talking about when he said, which society is happier? A society that has heroes or a society that is not in need of heroes? And I think it's the latter. So rather than putting anyone on a pedestal, I think we as human beings, as the people, to look at ourselves, because change is going to come from the civil society. I don't think change is going to come from the top, from politics or politicians in that sense, but it's going to come from the society, particularly the civil society. I'm also a big believer in the fact that change is going to come from the margins, from people who have been left out, left behind, people who feel voiceless or disempowered. We have to listen to them more. I think inequality is not a side issue. It's not a footnote, it has to be at the center, all of our debates. If we can do that, if we can mend inequalities, mend hurts, then I think we can move forward. So in times of darkness, rather than looking for heroes, I look around and I realize there is no such thing as ordinary people, We all have multiple stories, and that's why a diversity, inclusion, civil society, and change that comes from bottom up, that to me is very, very important.
It's quite interesting because I agree with you about the hero. Well, again, language could be very dangerous, and we heard a lot in the NHS about the hero narrative and the hero nurses and doctors and frontline workers. And it's deeply problematic because heroes can become martyrs quite easily, and the word sacrifice becomes problematic when people didn't have adequate access always to the correct PPE. And so I feel like if we are going to use that wartime language of heroes, then let's talk about war crimes. That's how angry I am about the whole thing. But the language seems to have shifted, I think, recently, and we haven't been hearing too much about heroes. But I think nurses particularly agree with you that heroes is a problem word, actually.
Yeah.
Becky in Wales, hello Becky in Wales, says, do you feel that it is valuable to confront issues such as the dehumanization of others directly on social media? Or does this just fan the flames of division? So a social media question.
Lovely question. And I hear, of course, the doubt with regards to social media. In my opinion, social media is a bit like the moon. It does have a bright side in the sense that it does connect us regardless of national borders. It does give a chance to people from very different parts of the world to connect. Relatively, it has an egalitarian structure. I come from the Middle East, and I've seen many women who do not have an equal voice, space in the public space, carving out an area, a voice for themselves in the digital world. So I can't belittle that. Also, in countries where media is suppressed, sometimes social media helps people to get better information, to realize that they're not alone, actually, especially in undemocratic countries. So all of that seems to be the positive side. But because as human beings, we have focused on the positive side of social media for too long, we are a bit late to realize its dark side, the shadows that it has. And those shadows are very important. And it's becoming a major problem in our world. So I think we urgently need to talk about the problems of social media and take monopolies. I don't want anyone in this life to have extreme power, too much power. It's not healthy. Would we want our politicians to have extreme power? No. Then why do we allow tech companies to have extreme power over our lives? So there are questions we need to ask. What's going on? What's happening with our data? How they're being used? The fact that there's no transparency? How the algorithms can radicalize people without them being aware of it? How they can spread disinformation, slander, hate speech? I find all of that very problematic. And I think we urgently need to talk about it and focus on this. On the other hand, does it have any meaning to do activism on social media? I think yes. Yes, and I find it important that we also become digital citizens and keep an eye on what's happening on our digital spaces.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm on the editorial board of Index on Censorship, which I believe you've written for before. But I think the surveillance at the moment is such a key issue. And again, our eyes are on so many issues. It's hard. The to-do list at the moment, pandemic, democracy, economy, there's so many things that it's very difficult to keep a focus on freedom of expression and surveillance. But I think it's a very, very important thing. And social media is a big sort of, I suppose, worry, but also a hopeful thing as well for so many people. Yeah, it's kind of nuanced. So I've got loads of questions here. So Jody asks, you talked about in-betweenism, which I love that concept. Have we faced the challenge of in-betweenism before? And if so, how and why is it different now?
Thank you. There are times when, I'm so sorry. I'm just going to plug this in. Sorry, I just realized my battery is running low. I wouldn't want this to cut off. There are times in human history when we have gone through moments of in between them. But right now there's something new happening. And for that, we need to talk about digital technologies. We need to talk about an deeply interconnected world. We have massive global challenges ahead right now, starting with climate emergency. Our planet is burning. We do not have another planet B. And unfortunately, we have too many people questioning the validity of climate emergency and believing in their own misinformation. That is a major problem. We are also facing global challenges from cyber terrorism to the possibility of a huge financial crisis to the possibility of another pandemic. We live in such a world in which a virus in one part of the world affects the lives and livelihoods of someone, let's say, living in Canada. So it is wiser for us, healthier for us to deal with these global challenges together rather than being divided into our tribes. But the paradox is, at a moment when we have increasing global challenges, we have politicians who are trying to respond to those challenges through nationalism, through populism, and through tribalism. It's not going to work. So that is very, very new. And when that is mixed with in between them, I think it increases the complexity of the times we're living in.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think that, the in-betweendom is, it feels like maybe this has happened before, but perhaps you're right, Elif, the existential threat that we have, well, we have many existential threats right now, but climate change is something that is completely new and absolutely terrifying. And that's linked to democracy and the economy and everything else, because we need to know what's going to happen in America. Obviously, that is the biggest existential threat that's facing all of us.
Yes.
And hanging over everything. And it's interdependent, as we are interdependent. We all depend on everyone else. There's no such thing as independence or concrete thinking. We just thought there was. And so we're in that space where everyone says, oh, I thought that the things were important. The cult of youth, stuff, things, money actually don't really matter as much as we thought. So in a way, that's a hopeful idea as well as a kind of terrifying new space that we're in. Okay, let me read some more questions. So Ariel M asks, sometimes my empathy hinders the support I'd like to give. How do you detach enough to help?
Detach enough to help someone else. Detach from what? From our own truth? Or
maybe I'm not sure. All I've got is sometimes my empathy hinders the support I'd like to give. How do you detach enough to help? Maybe it's about, I'm thinking about it with a nursing head. And sometimes, obviously you have to have a balance between feeling so much for somebody and walking in their shoes and going on a journey with them, but also being able to stay professional and do your job and help them. So I wonder if that was the question. But I guess, I don't know what you think about this, Elif, but I think that detachment is perhaps not the right thing to do. And maybe we need to not detach. That's the point. It's an anti-numbness.
Maybe detachment is not the word that I would use, but I think I understand the question. And in that sense, there's no end to, and there shouldn't be an end to our questioning, because when we empathize with someone else's story, we should not forget that there is the other of the other too, So looking for justice, looking for freedom, equality, it is a long journey. It's a complicated journey. And we should always be open to also questioning our own truths. I think that is very important. Earlier, you were talking about language. It is so important. A couple of times we referred to this. When I first came to the UK, it's been more than 12 years now, I used to think British people are so calm when they talk about politics. It's amazing. And I no longer feel that way, because I think that calmness has disappeared. And what is worrying me, actually, is this language, political language, full of martial metaphors. Words like surrender, betrayal, and suddenly talking about opponents as enemies. We might have all kinds of disagreements. That doesn't make you my enemy. So not to forget these principles of coexistence, principles of diversity, inclusion. I think that is going to help us in our journey of empathy. If I may add this, I come from a country that has never appreciated diversity and that has lost its cosmopolitan heritage. And I honestly think by losing that, we've lost a lot. I'm not talking about an economic loss, although that too, political loss, although that too, but something in human conscience is lost when we lose respect for diversity. So remembering those principles might also help us in our journey through empathy.
Yeah, definitely. Lizana from Hertfordshire says, do you feel the writer has a responsibility to influence and develop the reader's empathy?
Beautiful questions.
Yeah, lovely questions.
Lovely questions. I think I make a distinction between questions and answers. I believe a writer's job is to ask questions, difficult questions about difficult issues, and open up a space, an open space, a free space in which a diversity of opinions can be heard. That is very important because the novel, in particular, our genre, I think it's one of the last remaining democratic spaces. So we need to keep that freedom of voices on page. But that said, a writer's job is not to try to give the answers or to try to preach something or teach something. Actually, I don't like that. And I find it quite off-putting because I don't know the answers myself, but I treasure the questions. If we can allow people to read, to come into contact with different opinions, it's always up to the reader to come up with their own answers. And every reader's answers is going to be different because people bring their own gaze into the story. No reader is passive. So we create the story together. And in that sense, everybody's reading is unique, again, like their fingerprints. And I have to respect that. But my job, your job, I think our job is to ask the questions that matter.
Yeah, and it's quite a comfort during this time that people they might not be able to travel physically, but everyone can travel into other worlds in books. And what a comfort that has been, definitely during the lockdown particularly, but even at this time generally. How do you, hang on a sec. Yes. How has this pandemic changed your definitions of happiness and health? That's quite an interesting question.
Beautiful question. Early on, I was thinking about this. There were some messages shared on social media saying, writers find it easier to go through the pandemic because they're solitary creatures anyhow. They're used to working at home. That wasn't my experience at all. And every writer that I've spoken with was actually struggling. So it is an important time for all of us, I think, to stop what we're doing and to ask ourselves what kind of a life I want to live. What are my priorities? This is it's a crisis, but not only a health crisis, not only a social justice crisis. It's, as we spoke earlier, a crisis of meanings. So even our most basic concepts, such as democracy, such as happiness, I think we need to redefine them. And I found myself asking and realizing and maybe appreciating more and more seemingly small moments in daily life, like to be able to go out, just to sit under a tree and to be able to read a book sitting under a tree without seemingly doing anything, slowing down. I think we all need to slow down a little bit because we're living in an age of speed, we're living in an age of information, and I don't think that's a good thing. In the book, I make a distinction between information, knowledge, and wisdom. I think we have way too much information. And the truth is, we cannot process it. It doesn't stay with us. It doesn't shift anything in our soul. What we need is knowledge. And ultimately, what we need is wisdom. So we need to decrease the amount of information we are dealing with, focus more on knowledge, which comes from books, which comes from investigative journalism, which comes from slowing down and putting more thought into things. And then ultimately wisdom, which requires the combination of the mind and the heart and emotional intelligence. And in that regard, I think I would say my priorities would be more knowledge, less information, hopefully, much more wisdom in the long run.
Yeah. I definitely agree. I feel like we're just at the beginning of this search for meaning, and we're almost at a tipping point. I know the threshold idea, I think it's really interesting because it feels like we're at the top of a mountain just looking around and saying, well, what can the next bit be for us individually and collectively? And there is a choice there, individually and collectively.
Sure.
So although it feels like a terrible time in many ways, it also feels hopeful.
Yes.
And I think on that note, I'm going to ask you the last question and then I'll summarize, which is a beautiful question. What can we look forward to or be hopeful about over this upcoming winter?
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah.
I think in an interesting way, we've realized better and better that we have to be more passionate advocates for human rights, for equality, for women's rights, rather than thinking, well, these things are already achieved in some parts of the world and they will be achieved sooner or later in some other parts of the world. So somehow we have become actually more active citizens, which would make Hannah Arendt, for instance, very happy because she was always warning about the dangers of not being active, engaged citizens. To see women's movements gaining momentum, to see voices who speak up for minorities, Black Lives Matter, people asking, demanding for change. To me, that is very important. Also to see young people, because demographically, and that's the paradox of the world we're living in, because when you look at it demographically, the number of people who believe in rule of law, democracy, equality actually is growing and growing because younger people are very much aware, engaged, passionate about justice. The problem is they don't have the power. It doesn't translate necessarily into power and their voices are unheard. So this is an interesting time in which we realize if us human beings, we connect, there's so much we can do. We can create change. Change is possible. And overall, I think what we can look forward to is more global sisterhood, for more global solidarity and sharing our stories and creating the change we want together. So a feeling of togetherness is something that I'll be looking forward to.
That's wonderful. Well, I'm afraid our time is coming to an end. Just to kind of think about our discussion, the things that I'm going to take away are the idea that we have all these existential threats facing us, and we are living in an age of anxiety and anger and disillusionment and apathy. And perhaps apathy is the most dangerous thing of all. So I love the idea that you've given us some tips to be hopeful, and that idea of conscious optimism, which is the overriding, I suppose, theme to this book. It's a very, very hopeful book, and I hope everyone goes out and buys Elif's book. It's I always think that non-fiction is fact and fiction is truth. Well, this book is fact and it's truth. And so you've done something really remarkable. And it did remind me so much of The Prophet, which I have to say, maybe go and reread The Prophet. I think you're a prophet for our times, Elif. And I would absolutely love to see you in Parliament. I know you're busy writing, and that's very important too. So thank you so much. I know everyone's going to go out and buy a copy of your book, How to Stay Sane in an Age of Division, which is super important. And also, please check out wellcome.org for all the events. And this will be on the YouTube channel, and it's being recorded. And finally, I want to say a huge, huge thank you to Elif Shafak for joining us for this incredible talk. Thank you so, so much from all of us. Thank you.
Christie, thank you so much. I'm so thankful. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's been very special. Thank you.
Thank you.